Beneath the blood-red sunset of River's Edge, Texas, Henry Brooks trudges through his parched cornfield, unaware that tonight his own blood will soak the soil he's toiled on for 45 years to shield his family. But why did his son, a SEAL Team 6 commander, leave him and his wife to face the merciless blades of Los Jaguares without a whisper of warning? This haunting silence hides a mystery that will shock you, break your heart, and spark fierce debate. How far does family loyalty stretch before it snaps? Subscribe now to uncover the truth. The sun bled red over River's Edge, Texas, casting long shadows across the cracked, thirsty earth of Henry Brooks' cornfield. At 72, Henry moved slower these days, his gnarled hands trembling as he knelt to check the irrigation lines snaking through the rows of stunted stalks. It wasn't just age that made his fingers shake. It was something heavier, a gnawing unease that had settled in his chest like a stone over the past week. The border, just a few miles south, had been too quiet lately, the kind of quiet that whispered trouble in a language only a farmer who'd weathered 45 seasons could hear. Up on the weathered porch of their modest farmhouse, Clara Brooks stood with her silver hair pulled back tight, her sharp hazel eyes scanning the horizon. At 68, she still carried the stubborn fire of her youth, though the lines etched into her face told stories of drought, loss, and resilience. Her calloused hand rested absently on the satellite phone tucked into her apron pocket, a gift from their son James, who'd insisted they keep it close. "For emergencies, Mom," he'd said the last time he visited, his voice steady but his eyes shadowed with a soldier's weight. She hadn't touched it in months, but tonight, its cold metal felt like a lifeline against her fingertips. The crunch of gravel under tires broke the stillness as Sheriff Tom Wheeler's patrol car rolled up the dirt drive. Dust swirled in the fading light as he stepped out, his broad shoulders slouched under the weight of bad news. Henry straightened, brushing dirt from his knees, and met Tom halfway across the yard. Clara stayed on the porch, her posture rigid, listening. "Henry, Clara," Tom began, his voice low and rough like the wind over dry grass. "I've got word from some folks down south, Los Jaguares. They're moving north and they've got their eyes on your place. They want it as a staging point for their shipments. I'd feel a hell of a lot better if you two packed a bag and stayed with kin for a spell." Clara's laugh cut through the air, sharp and brittle. "Tom Wheeler, this is our home. 45 years we've held this land through storms, bank notices, and worse. You think a bunch of border rats are going to scare us off now?" Her words were steel, but Henry caught the flicker of something softer in her eyes. Pride, yes, but also a mother's quiet ache for the boy who wasn't here to stand beside them. Tom shifted his weight, his hand hovering near his holster. "These ain't your average smugglers, Clara. They're pros. Military-grade gear, trained men. I've known you both since I was in short pants, and I'm telling you, this isn't a fight you can win with a shotgun and grit." Henry glanced at Clara, then back at Tom. "We've got family right where we need 'em, Tom, right here." He tapped his chest, his voice steady but carrying an edge of something unspoken. Tom sighed, tipped his hat, and climbed back into his cruiser, leaving the dust to settle like a warning. Thousands of miles away, in a dimly lit command center, James Brooks sat hunched over a bank of monitors, his jaw tight as he scrolled through satellite feeds. At 42, he was a man carved from discipline, broad-shouldered, eyes like flint, every move precise. As commander of SEAL Team 6, he'd faced down warlords and terrorists, but tonight his focus wasn't on some distant battlefield. It was on a small patch of Texas dirt that held everything he'd ever loved. His fingers brushed the dog tags around his neck, pausing on the thin silver chain looped through them, a gift from his mother years ago, engraved with her name in delicate script. Clara. She'd pressed it into his hand before his first deployment, her voice trembling despite her smile. "So you'll always carry a piece of home, James." He'd worn it through every mission since, a talisman against the chaos of war. "Sir," a voice interrupted. Lieutenant David Carter stepped into the room, his young face taut with urgency. We've got unusual vehicle movement near River's Edge. Thermal signatures too organized for locals. Could be Cartel. James's heart thudded, a rare crack in his iron composure. He zoomed in on the grainy feed, the familiar outline of his parents' farm coming into focus. "That's home," he muttered, his voice barely audible, laced with a fear he hadn't felt since he was a boy, watching his father mend fences in the dark. Back at the farm, Clara stepped off the porch to join Henry as the last light faded. The sky was a bruise of purple and crimson, the air thick with the scent of dry earth and impending rain. "Tom's worried," she said, her tone softer now, almost tender. "Always has been, since he was a kid trailing you around the fields." Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on the southern tree line where shadows seemed to shift just beyond sight. "He's right to be. Something's coming, Clara. I can feel it in the ground." He reached for her hand, their fingers interlocking with the ease of decades spent side by side. "James taught us how to handle trouble. We've got the tools." Clara squeezed his hand, her thumb brushing the calluses on his knuckles. "He didn't just teach us tools, Henry. He taught us to wait, to let them think we're nothing but old farmers too stubborn to run." She smiled faintly, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "He's out there, isn't he? Watching over us, even now?" Henry pulled her close, resting his chin on her head. "He's always been our boy, Clara. Wherever he is, he'll come when we need him." In the command center, James leaned back, his mind racing. He'd spent years preparing his parents, basic traps, a hidden camera, that satellite phone, but he'd never told them the full truth. The border threats he'd tracked, the whispers of cartels eyeing their land. Why hadn't he warned them outright? Was it trust in their strength, or his own arrogance as a soldier who thought he could control everything from afar? The question gnawed at him as he barked an order. "Carter, get the team ready. We're going home." The night deepened over River's Edge, the stars swallowed by clouds rolling in from the south. Henry and Clara stood together, silhouetted against the farmhouse, unaware that the quiet they cherished was about to shatter. And somewhere in the darkness, Los Jagares were already moving, their headlights cutting through the night like the eyes of predators closing in. The moon hung low over River's Edge, Texas, a pale sliver casting faint silver across the Brooks farm. The air was thick, heavy with the promise of rain that never seemed to come, and the distant hum of crickets filled the night like a heartbeat. Inside the farmhouse, Henry Brooks sat at the worn oak table, a kerosene lantern flickering between him and Clara. His weathered hands traced the edge of a small metal box. A makeshift alarm system James had rigged years ago, hidden beneath the floorboards of the barn. It wasn't much, just a motion sensor tied to a buzzer, but it was one of the quiet gifts their son had left behind, a soldier's way of watching over them. Clara stood by the sink, her silhouette sharp against the dim glow filtering through the curtains. She rinsed a chipped coffee mug, her movements slow and deliberate, but her eyes kept darting to the window. The satellite phone sat on the counter now, its dull black surface catching the light. She hadn't said it aloud, but Henry knew she was thinking of James, his last visit 2 Christmases ago when he'd knelt by that very counter and pressed the phone into her hands. "If anything feels off, Mom," he'd said, his voice low and firm, "you hit this button. I don't care where I am, I'll come running." She'd laughed then, brushing it off as a boy's overprotectiveness, but tonight her fingers lingered near it like it was a loaded gun. "Henry," she said finally, breaking the silence, "you think Tom's right, that these Jaguars are more than we can handle?" Her voice was steady, but there was a crack in it, a thread of doubt woven into the steel. Henry leaned back, the chair creaking under him. "Tom's a good man, Clara, but he's always seen us as folks who need saving. James didn't raise us to run, he raised us to stand." He tapped the table, his callous knuckles drumming a rhythm born of decades on this land. "Besides, we've got his tricks up our sleeves. They won't see us coming." Clara smiled faintly, a ghost of warmth crossing her face. "That boy of ours, He's got a head full of war and a heart full of home. She turned to the window again, her breath fogging the glass. I just hope he's not too far to hear us if we call. 3 miles south, Victor Salazar crouched in the shadow of a rusted trailer, his dark eyes glinting as he studied a crumpled map under the beam of a flashlight. The leader of Los Jaguares was a wiry man, all sharp angles and sharper ambition, his face scarred from years of border wars. Around him, a dozen men in black tactical gear checked their rifles and night vision goggles, their movements precise, almost mechanical. These weren't the scrappy coyotes who ran drugs across the Rio Grande. These were professionals, ex-soldiers turned mercenaries, hired muscle for a cartel with bigger plans than dope. 2 old Americans, Salazar sneered, his voice a low rasp as he traced a finger over the Brooks farm on the map. A crumbling house, a few acres of dirt. They'll be begging us to take it by dawn. His lieutenant, a stocky man with a buzz cut, nodded, marking entry points with a red pen. Son's military, but he's overseas. Local sheriff's a nobody. 15 minutes before he even knows we're there. Easy pickings. Salazar folded the map, his grin widening. By sunrise, this place is ours. A perfect corridor, highway access, storage, sight lines. We'll own the border from here to El Paso. He didn't know, couldn't know, that the crumbling house he mocked was laced with traps as subtle as a spider's web, spun by a son who'd spent years turning his parents' home into a quiet fortress. Back at the farm, Henry stepped out to the barn, the night air cool against his skin. He pried up a loose floorboard, revealing the sensor James had installed, one of a handful scattered around the property. It wasn't military grade, just a hunting gadget repurposed with a soldier's ingenuity, but it'd buzz loud enough to wake them if anything crossed the perimeter. He tested it, flicking the switch, and the faint hum steadied his nerves. "Good boy," he muttered, a flicker of pride cutting through his worry. Clara joined him, her boots scuffing the hay-strewn floor. She carried a flashlight, its beam sweeping the stalls where heat lamps, another of James's additions, hung innocently above the chicken coops. He said these could mess with their fancy goggles, she recalled, her voice softening. Turn night into chaos for anyone who doesn't belong. She paused, her hand brushing the rough wood of a beam. You remember when he set this up? Barely 20, fresh out of basic, sneaking out here like a kid hiding a secret. Henry chuckled, the sound rough but warm. Told us it was for coyotes sniffing around the hens. Should have known he was thinking bigger. He met her gaze, and for a moment the years fell away. They were just parents marveling at the boy who'd grown into a man they barely understood but trusted with their lives. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. A soft thump echoed from the field. A cartel scout tripping over a hidden irrigation ditch, the ground softened deliberately by Henry that afternoon. The sensor buzzed, a low, insistent whine cutting through the barn. Henry's head snapped up, his pulse quickening. "They're here," he whispered, grabbing a shotgun from the wall, not to fight, but to buy time. Clara's hand flew to the satellite phone, her thumb hovering over the button. She didn't press it. Not yet. James had drilled it into them. Gather intel first. Let them think you're helpless. She nodded at Henry, her jaw set. Let's give 'em a welcome they won't forget. Out in the field, the scout cursed under his breath, his boots sinking into the mud. His night vision goggles flickered as the heat lamps flared to life, triggered by the sensor, a blinding patchwork of light that turned his high-tech gear into a useless blur. "What the hell?" he hissed into his radio, his voice tight with confusion. "This ain't no ordinary farm." Behind him, Salazar's convoy crept closer, headlights off, engines a low growl against the night. They saw the flickering lights, heard the scouts' panicked report, but pressed on, arrogance blinding them to the trap tightening around them. They thought they were hunting prey, 2 old farmers too stubborn to flee. They didn't know they were stepping into a web spun by a predator far deadlier than they could imagine. In the barn, Henry and Clara stood shoulder to shoulder, the buzz of the sensor fading into silence. The night stretched taut, a bowstring ready to snap. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, just as they always had. The night over River's Edge thickened, the air buzzing with tension as the first Cartel boots crunched against the gravel outside the Brooks' farmhouse. Inside, Henry Brooks pressed himself against the wall near the kitchen window, shotgun trembling in his grip. His breath came shallow, ragged, the taste of dust and fear coating his tongue. Clara stood a few feet away, her back to the counter, the satellite phone clutched in one hand like a prayer. The buzz from the barn sensor had faded, but the silence that followed was worse. A predator's pause before the strike. Outside, Victor Salazar signaled his men with a sharp flick of his wrist, his scarred face illuminated by the faint green glow of their night vision goggles. The team split into pairs, moving like shadows toward the house, their rifles slung low and ready. Salazar smirked, his voice a venomous whisper into his radio. "Old man, old woman, no fight in him. We'll be sipping tequila over their kitchen table by dawn." He didn't see the faint flicker of heat lamps in the barn, didn't hear the soft hum of the trap already set. The front door splintered with a single kick, wood cracking like brittle bones. Henry's heart lurched as three figures stormed in, their silhouettes hulking against the dim lantern light. "Down, Clara!" he barked, swinging the shotgun up, but his aim faltered. Age had dulled his reflexes. The lead man, a broad-shouldered thug with his shaved head, lunged forward and slammed the butt of his rifle into Henry's temple. Pain exploded behind his eyes, hot and blinding, and he crumpled to the floor, blood trickling warm down his cheek. "Henry!" Clara's scream tore through the room as she dropped the phone and threw herself toward him. Her knees hit the hardwood hard, her hands scrabbling to cradle his head. His blood smeared her fingers, sticky and dark, and for a moment all she could hear was the thud of her own pulse. "Stay with me, Henry," she whispered, her voice breaking, tears spilling onto his weathered face. The thug loomed over them, his lips curling into a sneer. "Where's that soldier son of yours, huh, Grandma?" He grabbed her arm, yanking her up with a force that made her gasp. "Call him! Tell him to come save his pathetic old folks!" His laughter was a jagged blade, cutting through the air as he shoved her against the counter. Clara's hand flailed, knocking over the lantern. It shattered, spilling kerosene and a tongue of flame across the floor. She didn't hesitate. With a sob choking her throat, she snatched the fallen satellite phone, her thumb jamming the distress button before the thug could react. A faint beep sounded, before the man ripped it from her grasp and smashed it against the wall. Plastic shards scattered like confetti, and he grabbed her by the collar, his breath hot and sour against her face. "Too late, lady. No one's coming." But thousands of miles away, in the belly of a military command center, James Brooks' world tilted. He'd been pacing, eyes locked on the satellite feed when the alert pinged, a sharp, insistent chime that stopped his heart. "Carter!" he roared, spinning toward the monitors. His Lieutenant David Carter was at his side in an instant, pulling up the hidden camera feed James had installed in the farmhouse years ago. The grainy image flickered to life. Henry sprawled on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Clara struggling against a towering figure, her face streaked with tears. "No," James breathed, his voice a raw, broken thing. His fists clenched, nails biting into his palms as rage and guilt crashed over him like a tidal wave. "They're hurting them. My parents." He slammed a hand against the console, the metal ringing under the blow. "Get the team airborne. Now we're going in." Carter hesitated, his young face paling. "Sir, we're prepped for a mission halfway across the world. Command won't—" "I don't give a damn about command," James snapped, his eyes blazing. "That's my family. Move!" His voice cracked and he turned away, hiding the tremor in his hands. He yanked his duffel from under the desk, pulling out a crumpled letter stuffed in the side pocket. Clara's handwriting, faded but clear. "James, no matter where you go, home's waiting. Don't let war steal your heart, son." He pressed it to his chest, the paper crinkling as tears burned his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I should have been there." The roar of helicopter blades filled the base as SEAL Team 6 mobilized. their commander a storm of fury and desperation. James strapped into the co-pilot seat, his jaw locked tight, the letter tucked against his chest like armor. Every second stretched into eternity, the distance between him and River's Edge a chasm he feared he'd cross too late. Back in the farmhouse, the fire from the spilled kerosene licked higher, casting wild shadows across the walls. Henry groaned, his vision swimming as he clawed at the floor, trying to reach Clara. She fought against the thug's grip, her nails digging into his arm, drawing blood. "You don't know my son," she spat, her voice raw but defiant. "He'll come, and you'll wish you'd never stepped foot here." The thug laughed again, hurling her to the ground beside Henry. "Keep dreaming, old lady. By the time he hears about this, we'll own this dump." He turned to his men, barking orders as smoke curled thicker, the flames creeping toward the curtains. "Search the place. Find anything worth taking. Then we torch it." Clara dragged herself to Henry, her hands trembling as she pressed them against his wound, trying to stem the blood. "Hold on, Henry," she pleaded, her tears dripping onto his chest. "James got the signal. He's coming." Henry's eyes fluttered, his breath shallow, but he managed a weak nod. "He's our boy," he rasped, his hand finding hers. "Always has been." Outside, Salazar watched the glow of fire spread from the house, his grin faltering as reports crackled through his radio. "Boss, something's off," one of his scouts hissed. "The field's a mess. Mud traps, lights screwing with our gear." Salazar's eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease cutting through his confidence. "Just two old farmers," he muttered, but the words sounded hollow now, like a lie he'd told himself too many times. Inside, the flames roared louder, a beast waking from slumber, and Clara clung to Henry, the heat searing her skin. The cartel thought they'd won, thought they'd broken two helpless souls. They didn't hear the distant thrum of helicopter blades slicing through the night sky, or know that a reckoning was racing toward them on wings of fury and love. Is his faith in their strength a soldier's pride worth admiring? Drop your thoughts below. I need to know where you stand. The farmhouse in River's Edge burned like a pyre against the Texas night, flames clawing at the sky as smoke billowed thick and black from the shattered windows. Inside, Henry Brooks lay crumpled on the kitchen floor, his blood a dark pool spreading beneath him, his breath a faint rasp against the roar of the fire. Clara knelt beside him, her hands slick with his blood, pressing desperately against the gash on his temple. "Stay with me, Henry," she sobbed, her voice cracking as tears carved tracks through the soot on her face. The heat pressed in, a suffocating beast, but she didn't move, couldn't move, her world narrowing to the man she'd loved for nearly half a century. Victor Salazar's men ransacked the house, their boots stomping through the chaos as they tore open drawers and upended furniture. The thug who'd struck Henry barked orders, his voice cutting through the crackle of flames. "Find anything worth a damn, then get out. This place is done." He barely glanced at the old couple, dismissing them as broken relics. Two farmers, too weak to matter. He didn't see Clara's trembling fingers slip beneath Henry's coat, searching for the hidden latch to the storm cellar James had built under the floorboards years ago. "Clara," Henry wheezed, his eyes fluttering open, clouded with pain but sharp with urgency. "The hatch, get us down there." His hand fumbled toward hers, guiding her to the spot. She nodded, swallowing a sob, and pressed the latch with a strength she didn't know she had left. A panel slid open with a groan, revealing a narrow shaft barely wide enough for one. "You first," Henry rasped, but Clara shook her head, her silver hair clinging damply to her forehead. "No, Henry, you're hurt. We go together or not at all." Her voice was steel wrapped in heartbreak, and she hooked her arms under his shoulders, dragging him toward the opening. Every inch was agony, his weight pulling at her aching joints, but she gritted her teeth and moved, fueled by a love that burned fiercer than the fire around them. The thug turned at the sound, his sneer twisting into a snarl. "What the hell?" He stormed over, kicking the hatch shut just as Clara got Henry halfway through. "You think you're slipping away, huh?" He grabbed a fistful of Clara's hair, yanking her back. She cried out, clawing at his arm, but he slung her against the wall, her head smacking the plaster with a sickening thud. Henry roared, a weak, guttural sound, and lunged up, only to collapse again, his strength spent. Outside, Salazar paced the yard, his radio crackling with static and confusion. "Boss, we've got a problem," one of his scouts reported, voice tight. "Lights in the field. Something's tripping our gear. This ain't right." Salazar's grin faded, his gut twisting. "Keep moving," he snapped. But doubt crept into his tone. He didn't hear the faint thrum growing louder in the distance, the sound of helicopter blades slicing through the night. Inside, the fire raged hotter, the ceiling beams groaning as they buckled. The thug loomed over Clara, raising his rifle butt again, but a sharp clack from the yard froze him. A grenade, one of Salazar's men tossing it toward the barn to clear their exit. The explosion rocked the house, a deafening blast that shattered the remaining windows and sent a fireball rolling through the kitchen. Clara screamed, throwing herself over Henry as debris rained down, but the grenade had landed too close to the cellar hatch. "Clara, go!" Henry shoved her toward the hatch with the last of his fading strength, his voice a desperate plea. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall, but turned back to him, eyes wide with terror. "Not without you!" she cried, reaching for him. The thug, dazed by the blast, staggered to his feet, but before he could act, Henry grabbed his ankle, pulling him down with a grunt. "Go, damn it!" Henry shouted, his face contorted with pain and resolve. Clara hesitated, tears streaming, but the fire surged, a wall of orange death roaring toward them. With a wrenching sob, she dove for the hatch, tumbling into the dark just as the flames licked at Henry's legs. The thug scrambled up, cursing, and hurled a second grenade after her, but Henry rolled, his body a shield, taking the blast full in the chest. The explosion shook the earth, a thunderclap of heat and shrapnel, and Clara hit the cellar floor hard, the hatch slamming shut above her, sealing her in darkness. Above, the farmhouse shuddered, its frame collapsing into a heap of glowing embers. Henry lay still, his blood-soaked shirt smoldering, his final whisper lost to the inferno. "Clara, keep it for James." His eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. He'd given her the seconds she needed, paid for with his life. Miles away, the helicopter carrying James Brooks screamed through the night, its blades a frantic heartbeat against the sky. He sat rigid, staring at the live feed from the farm's hidden camera, now just static after the explosion. "Faster!" he bellowed at the pilot, his voice raw, hands shaking as he clutched his mother's letter. The words swam before his eyes. "Don't let war steal your heart." Too late, he thought, his chest hollowed out by guilt. He'd seen the fire, the cartel, his father's blood, seen it all from a screen, helpless, hours away. "Sir," David Carter said, his tone cautious, "we're 10 minutes out. Satellite shows the house is gone, fire's spreading." James didn't respond, his gaze locked on the void where his home had been. "They're still there," he muttered, more to himself than Carter. "They have to be." The chopper descended, the glow of the burning farm lighting the horizon like a beacon of ruin. James leapt out before the skids touched dirt, his boots pounding the ground as he raced toward the wreckage, rifle in hand. "Mom! Dad!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the crackling flames. SEAL Team 6 fanned out behind him, but he didn't wait, couldn't wait, his world reduced to the desperate need to find them. He reached the smoldering heap that had been the kitchen, kicking through charred beams until he saw it, the hatch, warped but intact. "Here!" he yelled, dropping to his knees, clawing at the metal. Carter joined him, prying it open with a crowbar, and James peered into the dark. "Mom?" His voice broke, a boy calling for his mother. A faint cough answered him. Clara lay crumpled at the bottom, her face streaked with ash and blood, but alive. James slid down, gathering her into his arms, his tears falling onto her hair. "I'm here," he choked out. "I'm here." She clung to him, her voice a whisper. "Henry, he saved me." James looked up at the burning ruin, the weight of his father's sacrifice crashing into him. "Dad," he breathed, his heart shattering as the flames devoured the last of their home. The first light of dawn crept over River's Edge, Texas, painting the sky a bruised purple as the smoldering ruins of the Brooks farmhouse glowed like embers of a dying world. James Brooks knelt in the ash-filled cellar, his arms wrapped tight around his mother, Clara, her frail frame trembling against him. Her coughs racked her body, harsh and wet, stained with the smoke she'd breathed in the fiery chaos above. "Henry," she whispered again, her voice a fragile thread. "He saved me." James pressed his forehead to hers, his tears mixing with the soot on her face, his heart a splintered wreck. "I know, Mom," he choked out. "I know." Above them, the SEAL Team 6 moved with lethal precision, their boots crunching through the debris as they secured the perimeter. David Carter's voice crackled through James's earpiece, urgent and clipped. "Sir, we've got Salazar pinned in the yard. 5 hostiles left, heavily armed. But there's something else. They're rigging something big near the house." James's head snapped up, his soldier's instincts cutting through the fog of grief. "Rigging what?" he demanded, his grip on Clara tightening. Before Carter could answer, Victor Salazar's voice bellowed from the yard, a venomous snarl riding the wind. "You think this is over, soldier boy?" James climbed the cellar ladder, pulling Clara up behind him, and peered through the warped hatch. Salazar stood amid the wreckage, a detonator in one hand, his scarred face twisted with fury. Behind him, 2 of his men wrestled a metal crate into place. A crude, cylindrical device wired with blinking lights, its surface scrawled with faded military markings. "This farm's mine," Salazar shouted, "and if I can't have it, no one will." James's blood ran cold. "Carter, confirm, now," he barked into his comms, easing Clara behind a fallen beam for cover. Carter's reply came fast, edged with alarm. "It's a bomb, sir. High yield, looks like surplus ordnance. 30 seconds on the clock if he triggers it. Could level half the damn town." James's mind raced, his training clashing with the raw terror of losing more than he already had. "Get Mom out," he ordered Carter, who slid down into the cellar, scooping Clara into his arms despite her weak protests. "No, James," Clara cried, reaching for him as Carter carried her toward the chopper parked 50 yards away. "I'm not leaving you two." Her voice broke, a mother's plea slicing through the dawn, but James turned away, his jaw clenched. "I've got this," he muttered, more to himself than her, his eyes locked on Salazar. The cartel leader laughed, a jagged, unhinged sound, and raised the detonator high. "Say goodbye to your precious home, Brooks." His thumb hovered over the button, but James was already moving, low and fast, a shadow among the ashes. He vaulted over a charred table, closing the distance as Salazar's men opened fire. Bullets whizzed past, spitting dirt and splintering wood, but James rolled, his rifle barking in precise bursts. 2 hostiles dropped, their bodies slumping into the dust, blood pooling beneath them. "Carter, cut the power!" James yelled, diving behind a toppled tractor as Salazar's thumb twitched. Carter, now outside with Clara, relayed the order to the team. A SEAL sniper perched on a nearby ridge fired a single shot, shattering the crate's external wiring panel. Sparks flew, but the timer blinked on. 20 seconds now, a relentless countdown to oblivion. James lunged again, tackling Salazar just as the man pressed the detonator. The device beeped, a shrill warning, but James wrestled the remote free, smashing it under his boot. "You're done," he growled, pinning Salazar to the ground, his fist slamming into the man's jaw. Blood sprayed, Salazar's grin fading as he spat a tooth into the dirt. "Too late," he rasped. "It's armed." 10 seconds. James's eyes darted to the bomb, its lights pulsing faster. He shoved Salazar aside and scrambled to the crate, his fingers fumbling over the tangle of wires. "Carter, I need you here," he shouted, but Carter was still with Clara, shielding her near the chopper. James's training kicked in, red wire, blue wire, green, but this wasn't a textbook rig. Sweat stung his eyes, his hands shaking as the countdown hit 5. A shadow fell over him. "Clara!" Breaking free from Carter, staggering toward the bomb despite her coughing fits. "James," she gasped, her voice hoarse but steady. "The green one! Henry showed me. Vietnam. Green cuts the juice. James froze, staring at her, the weight of her words crashing into him. His father's ghost lingered in her eyes, a flicker of the man who'd defused bombs in jungles decades ago. 3 seconds. James grabbed the green wire, his breath held and yanked. The beeping stopped, the lights dying with a final flicker. Silence fell, heavy and surreal, broken only by the distant wail of the wind. James exhaled, collapsing to his knees, his hands trembling against the cold metal. "Mom," he whispered, turning to her. She sank beside him, her strength spent, and he pulled her close, burying his face in her shoulder. "You saved us." Clara's hand rested on his head, her touch weak but warm. "We saved each other," she murmured, her voice fading as exhaustion took hold. James held her tighter, the ash and blood of their home staining them both, a testament to what they'd lost and what they'd kept. Beyond the wreckage, the chopper's blades slowed and figures emerged from the dawn haze. Ellie Dawson from the diner, Jack Turner with his pickup, Dr. Sarah Nguyen clutching a medical bag. They'd heard the explosion, seen the fire from town, and come running. A ragtag band of neighbors drawn by the bonds of a small community. Ellie knelt beside Clara, pressing a water bottle to her lips, while Jack's son, a wiry kid named Tommy, stepped forward, clutching a handful of corn seeds he'd scavenged from the field. "Mrs. Brooks," he said shyly, "I'll help you plant these again for Mr. Henry." Clara's eyes glistened, a faint smile breaking through her grief. "Thank you, Tommy," she whispered, her voice cracking. James looked at the boy, then at the faces around them, worn, worried, but resolute. River's Edge wasn't just a place, it was a people, and they weren't letting go. Salazar groaned, still sprawled in the dirt, blood trickling from his mouth as Carter cuffed him. "You think you've won, Brooks?" he croaked, his laugh a wet gurgle. "This ain't the end. Bigger players than me want this land." James ignored him, his focus on Clara, but the words lingered, a shadow creeping into the fragile light of dawn. The sun rose higher, its rays cutting through the smoke, illuminating a farm reduced to rubble, but also a family, a town, clinging to hope amid the ashes. James stood, lifting Clara with him, his resolve hardening. "We'll rebuild," he vowed, his voice low but fierce. "For Dad, for us." The dawn over River's Edge, Texas, hung heavy with smoke and silence, the charred skeleton of the Brooks farmhouse a grim monument against the pale sky. James Brooks stood amid the rubble, his mother Clara leaning against him, her breath shallow and ragged from the night's ordeal. The bomb lay silent at their feet, its wires snipped like the threads of a nightmare cut short. But the weight of Henry's absence pressed down harder than the ash around them. SEAL Team 6 fanned out, securing Victor Salazar and his remaining men, their cuffs clinking in the quiet like a tolling bell. But the victory felt hollow. James's eyes kept drifting to the spot where his father had fallen, the ground still dark with his blood. David Carter approached, his young face streaked with soot, a battered laptop tucked under his arm. "Sir, we pulled this off Salazar's truck," he said, voice low but urgent. "It's encrypted, but I cracked the first layer. You need to see this." James shifted Clara gently to Ellie Dawson, who'd stayed close with a blanket and a steady hand, and took the device. The screen flickered to life, revealing a folder labeled River's Edge Ops. Files stamped with dates stretching back 20 years, far beyond any cartel's usual reach. James scrolled, his jaw tightening as he read. "This isn't just about drugs," he muttered, his voice a growl. "Los Jaguares were a front, puppets for something bigger." The documents detailed payments to private military contractors, PMCs, blueprints for chemical weapons, and a single name that stopped his breath: Henry Brooks. A grainy photo showed his father, younger, standing firm in this very field, rejecting a suited man's offer with a handshake refused. A note beneath it read, "Subject declined land sale, 2004, mark for acquisition, alternate means." "They've been after this place for decades," James said, his voice shaking with rage and realization. Dad knew! He stood in their way! Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide despite her exhaustion. Henry never told me, she whispered, her hands clutching the blanket. He said he turned down some city slicker years back, thought it was just business. Why didn't he say more? Before James could answer, a low rumble shook the ground. Tires on gravel, heavier than any sheriff's cruiser. 3 black SUVs rolled into view, their sleek frames cutting through the morning haze, windows tinted dark as midnight. Men in tactical gear poured out, their movements too polished for cartel grunts, their faces hidden behind gas masks. At their head stood Ethan Hayes, a lean figure in a crisp suit, his cold blue eyes scanning the wreckage with a predator's calm. "Commander Brooks," Hayes called, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "You've made a mess of our little operation. Hand over Salazar's files and we'll call this a misunderstanding." He gestured to the SUVs, where a faint hiss escaped, a canister being prepped, its surface glinting with a warning label James recognized from classified briefings. VX-7, Nerve Agent Prototype. James stepped forward, shielding Clara, his rifle still in hand. "You're not feds," he said, his tone ice cold. "Private contractors, PMC. Who's pulling your strings?" Hayes smirked, unfazed. "Doesn't matter. That laptop's ours and this town's too valuable to leave standing if you don't cooperate. One whiff of this gas and River's Edge is a ghost story." Clara coughed, her lungs straining, but she pushed past James, her frail form trembling with defiance. "You won't take this land," she rasped, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Henry died for it. I'll die for it too before I let you have it." Her words hit James like a punch, and he grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Mom, no," he said, his voice cracking. "I can't lose you too." Hayes raised a hand, and one of his men cracked open a canister, releasing a thin yellow vapor that curled toward the field. The corn stalks nearest it withered in seconds, their green fading to a sickly brown, a silent scream of death. Clara doubled over, hacking violently, her face paling as the fumes drifted closer. "James," she gasped, clutching his sleeve, "don't give it to them. If they win, Henry's gone for nothing." James's mind raced, torn between the soldier's logic screaming to protect his mother and the son's heart roaring to honor his father's stand. "Carter," he barked into his comms, "status on backup." Carter's voice crackled back, tense. "5 minutes out, sir. FBI's en route, but we're on our own. Till then, that gas'll kill us all if they deploy it." Hayes stepped closer, his smirk widening. 5 minutes is a lifetime, Brooks. Hand it over, or watch your mom choke." He nodded, and another canister hissed open, the yellow cloud thickening, creeping toward them like a living thing. James's grip tightened on the laptop, his knuckles white. Every instinct screamed to fight, but Clara's ragged breathing anchored him to a choice he couldn't bear. "James," Clara whispered, her hand on his cheek, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "You're my boy. You've always been enough. Fight! For us, for this town." Her words were a lifeline, a spark in the dark, and James made his call. "Carter, engage," he ordered, tossing the laptop to a seal behind him. "We hold the line." The team sprang into action, rifles spitting fire as Hayes's men returned volleys, bullets tearing through the dawn. James dragged Clara behind a burned-out tractor, shielding her as the gas edged closer, its acrid stink burning his throat. "Stay down, Mom," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'm not losing you, too." Hayes laughed, retreating to his SUV as the firefight erupted. "You're a dead man, Brooks, and this town's next." He slammed the door, his convoy peeling out, leaving the gas to do its work. James fired after them, his shots pinging off armored plating, but his focus shifted. Clara's coughs grew weaker, her skin clammy under his touch. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens broke through. Help was coming, but not fast enough. James held Clara close, his heart pounding as the yellow haze closed in, a shadow deeper than any cartel revealing itself. This wasn't just about land. It was about power, buried in secrets his father had died to defy. The morning sun struggled to pierce the yellow haze choking River's Edge, Texas, its light warped by the creeping nerve gas unleashed by Ethan Hayes' PMC. James Brooks crouched behind the rusted shell of a tractor, his mother Clara pressed against him, her frail body racked by coughs that grew wetter, weaker with every breath. The air burned his lungs, sharp and chemical, a death sentence seeping closer as gunfire echoed through the dawn. SEAL Team 6 held their ground, their rifles barking defiance against Hayes' retreating convoy, but the gas was the real enemy now, an invisible reaper tightening its grip. James clutched Clara's hand, his eyes darting between her paling face and the laptop David Carter had tossed back to him, its screen still glowing with the damning files. "Mom," he said, his voice raw, trembling with a fear he hadn't felt since his first firefight, "I can't lose you too, not after Dad." Clara's hazel eyes met his, cloudy with pain but blazing with the same fire that had carried her through decades of hardship. "James," she rasped, her grip tightening despite her weakness. "You're not losing me. You're saving us. Henry, me, this town. Don't let them win." Her words were a knife twisting in his chest, tearing him between the soldier's duty to fight and the son's desperate need to protect. "Carter!" he barked into his comms, his tone sharp despite the tremor. "How long till backup?" Carter's voice crackled back, strained as bullets pinged around him. 3 minutes, sir. FBI's closing in, but this gas? We've got maybe 2 before it's lethal. Orders?" James's mind raced, his training screaming options. Fall back, secure Clara, surrender the files. But every path felt like betrayal. Hayes's parting shot rang in his ears. Hand it over or watch your mom choke. He could end this, give the PMC what they wanted, save her, save River's Edge. But Clara's plea, if they win, Henry's gone for nothing, burned hotter than the gas searing his throat. "Carter," he said finally, his voice hardening. "We fight. Take them down. Keep that laptop secure." Carter hesitated, then snapped a crisp, "Yes, sir." The SEALs shifted, their gunfire intensifying as they targeted Hayes' men still lingering near the SUVs. James pulled Clara closer, shielding her with his body as he fired over the tractor, his shots precise despite the chaos. A PMC soldier dropped, clutching his chest, but the gas kept coming, a yellow tide now lapping at their feet. Clara's coughs turned to gasps, her head lolling against his shoulder, and panic clawed at James's resolve. "Stay with me, Mom," he pleaded, his free hand brushing her sweat-soaked hair. "Just a little longer." She managed a faint nod, her lips moving soundlessly, "Fight." And James's heart shattered anew. He'd lost Henry to fire. He wouldn't lose her to poison. But as he scanned the battlefield, a new threat emerged. Hayes, leaning from his SUV's window, barking into a radio as a fourth vehicle rolled up, its cargo bay open, revealing a larger canister. Its surface etched with VX-7B. A bomb, not just gas, a chemical warhead rigged to wipe River's Edge off the map. "Carter," James shouted, his voice hoarse, "they've got a damn bomb! 10 minutes on that timer if they arm it!" Carter's reply was grim. "Confirmed, sir. Remote trigger. We're pinned, can't get close." James's stomach dropped, his gaze snapping to the laptop. One of Salazar's files flashed in his memory, a schematic labeled Shadow Echo, a nerve agent project tied to PMCs and high-level clearances, far beyond cartel schemes. This wasn't just about land, it was a cover-up, a secret buried in blood and ash, and his father had been the first to pay. Hayes' voice cut through the chaos, amplified by a megaphone. "Last chance, Brooks. Files for your town, or we detonate and blame it on a gas leak. Your call." The timer blinked on. 10 minutes, a death knell ticking down. James's hands shook, the laptop a lead weight in his grip. Clara's breathing faltered, her skin clammy, and he knew, no, 2 minutes for the gas, 10 for the bomb. No time for both. "James," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're enough, always have been." Her hand cupped his cheek, weak but steady, and tears spilled down his face. "Mom, I can't," he started, but she cut him off, her eyes fierce. "You must. For Henry, for me." Her words were a command, a mother's final stand, and James broke. "Carter!" he roared. "Cover me!" "I'm going for the bomb." He surged forward, dragging Clara behind the tractor as Carter's team laid down suppressive fire. Bullets whizzed past, one grazing his arm, blood soaking his sleeve. But he didn't stop. He propped Clara against the metal, her head slumping, and charged toward the SUV, rifle blazing. Hayes ducked back, shouting orders, and the PMC soldiers rallied, their shots tearing chunks from the ground around him. 8 minutes. James reached the vehicle, slamming his shoulder into a soldier and wrenching the man's rifle free. He fired point blank, dropping another, and dove for the bomb, its timer glaring red. 7 minutes now. Wires tangled like a snake pit, and his hands fumbled, slick with sweat and blood. "Carter, I need a demo expert," he yelled, but Carter's voice was grim. "None here, sir. We're outmatched." Hayes laughed from the SUV, speeding away as the gas thickened. "You're dead, Brooks. All of you." James ignored him, his focus narrowing to the bomb, but Clara's coughs echoed behind him, weaker still. He glanced back. She'd crawled from the tractor, clutching the seeds Tommy had given her, her eyes locked on him. "James," she mouthed, "don't stop." 6 minutes. The gas burned his eyes, his lungs screaming, and Clara's gasps faded. He was losing her, losing everything, but shadow echoes, truth pulsed in his veins. This was bigger than them, bigger than River's Edge, and Henry's death demanded it end here. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, tears streaming as he turned back to the wires, his hands steadying with a soldier's resolve. The sirens wailed closer, FBI seconds away, but the timer ticked on and Clara's breathing slowed to a whisper. James faced the choice: cut the wire and risk it all, or save her and let the truth die. The dawn over River's Edge, Texas, was a battlefield of light and shadow, the sun's rays clawing through the yellow haze of nerve gas as James Brooks knelt before the chemical bomb, its timer glaring red. 5 minutes and counting. Sweat stung his eyes, his hands trembling over a snarl of wires, the acrid burn of VX7 searing his throat with every breath. Behind him, Clara Brooks lay slumped against the rusted tractor, her frail body racked by coughs that faded into faint, wet gasps. The seeds Tommy had given her slipped from her fingers, scattering across the ash-strewn ground, a fragile promise amid the chaos. "Mom!" James shouted, his voice breaking as he glanced back, his heart a hammer against his ribs. She was dying, slipping away in the poison he couldn't stop, and the weight of it crushed him. Henry was gone, burned to save her, and now she was fading too, her hazel eyes dimming as they locked on him. "Stay with me," he pleaded, but her lips barely moved, her breath a whisper lost to the wind. Gunfire raged around them, SEAL Team 6 trading shots with Ethan Hayes' PMC soldiers, their bullets tearing through the morning air. David Carter's voice crackled through James's comms, urgent and strained. "Sir, FBI's 30 seconds out, hold on." But 30 seconds was an eternity, and the bomb's timer ticked down. 4 minutes now, a relentless march toward annihilation. James' fingers hovered over the green wire Clara had named, her words echoing through his panic. "Henry showed me, green cuts the juice." Vietnam, decades ago. His father's ghost guiding them still. Clara stirred, her hand clawing at the dirt, dragging herself toward him despite the gas stealing her strength. "James," she rasped, her voice a thread of steel through the haze. "Don't stop." She coughed, blood flecking her lips, and James's world tilted, grief and duty warring in his chest. "Mom, I can't," he started, but she cut him off, her hand reaching his boot, her touch a lifeline. "Green," she whispered, her eyes fierce with a mother's love. "Cut it." 3 minutes. James' breath hitched, tears blurring his vision as he gripped the wire cutters. "I'm losing you," he choked out, his voice raw, a son's cry against a soldier's resolve. Clara's smile was faint, her face pale as death, but her gaze held him steady. "You're not losing me," she said, her words slow, deliberate. "You're saving everyone. Henry taught me, you taught me, we're enough." Her hand fell limp, her eyes fluttering shut, and James roared, a sound of anguish and rage that drowned the gunfire. "Mom!" He lunged to her, cradling her against his chest, her head lolling as he pressed his cheek to hers. "Don't go, please, don't go." Her breath was a feather, barely there, and the timer hit 2 minutes, its beep a cruel heartbeat. "I can't do this alone," he sobbed, tears streaming into her hair, his world collapsing into the space between her fading gasp. But Clara's eyes opened one last time, a flicker of light in the dark. "You're never alone," she whispered, her voice a ghost of strength. "Henry, me, the town, we're here." Her hand brushed his, guiding it to the cutters, and with a final trembling effort, she nodded. "Now, 1 minute." James's sobs shook him, but her words, her faith, ignited something deep, a fire born of love and loss. He turned to the bomb, his hand steadying as he clamped the cutters around the green wire. "For you, Mom," he breathed, and cut. The beep stopped, the lights died, and silence crashed over them, heavy and absolute. The bomb went dark, its threat snuffed out, but James didn't move. His arms tightened around Clara, willing her to breathe, to stay. She didn't. Her chest stilled, her hands slack in his, and a wail tore from James' throat, raw and primal, echoing across the ravaged farm. "No!" He rocked her, his tears soaking her face, the gas fading as FBI sirens screamed into the yard, too late to save her. Henry had burned for her. Clara had died for them all, her last act a mother's sacrifice to stop the shadow that had claimed her husband. Carter stumbled through the haze, his rifle slung low, and dropped beside James, his face pale. "Sir, she's..." He couldn't finish, his voice breaking as he gripped James's shoulder. "She's saved us." James didn't hear him, lost in the void where Clara's warmth had been, her seeds scattered around them like stars fallen to earth. The FBI swarmed in, black SUVs screeching to a halt as agents in hazmat suits secured the bomb, their shouts a distant hum. Hayes's men surrendered, their fight bleeding out with the gas, but James didn't care. His world was ash and silence, his parents gone in a single night. He pressed Clara's hand to his lips, his sobs quieting into a broken whisper. "I'm so sorry." But then, footsteps, soft and hesitant, cut through his grief. Ellie Dawson emerged from the smoke, her diner apron streaked with dirt, leading a small knot of townsfolk. Jack Turner, Dr. Sarah Nguyen, and little Tommy, his arms full of salvaged corn seeds. They stopped a few feet away, their faces etched with loss but lit with something stronger. Tommy stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "Mr. James," he said, holding out the seeds. "Mrs. Clara gave me these. Said they're for tomorrow. We'll plant 'em for her, for Mr. Henry." James looked up, his vision blurred with tears, and saw not just a boy, but a promise. A town unbroken, a legacy alive in the hands of its children. Ellie knelt beside him, her hand gentle on his arm. "She fought for us," she said softly. "We'll fight for her." Dr. Nguyen checked Clara's pulse, her head bowing in quiet respect, while Jack's gruff voice added, "Ain't no gas or bomb taking River's Edge, not while we're here." James cradled Clara one last time, laying her gently on the ground, her face peaceful in death. He stood, wiping his eyes, his grief a storm held at bay by a flicker of hope. "For you," he whispered to her, then turned to Tommy, taking a seed. "We'll plant them together." The sun rose higher, burning through the haze, and River's Edge stood, battered, bleeding, but alive. Clara's last tear had fallen, but her light lived on, a spark James vowed to carry forward. The sun climbed higher over River's Edge, Texas, its light cutting through the thinning haze of nerve gas, casting long shadows across the smoldering ruins of the Brooks farm. James Brooks stood alone in the wreckage, his mother Clara's body cradled gently in his arms one last time before he laid her beside the charred spot where Henry had fallen. His hands trembled as he brushed her silver hair from her face, her peaceful expression a stark contrast to the chaos that had stolen her. Tears streaked his soot-stained cheeks, but his jaw was set, a soldier's resolve hardening beneath the grief. "You gave everything," he whispered, his voice raw. "Now it's my turn." FBI agents swarmed the scene, their black SUVs forming a perimeter as hazmat teams secured the chemical bomb, its silent husk a testament to Clara's final act. Victor Salazar and Ethan Hayes' PMC soldiers sat cuffed in the dirt, heads bowed under the weight of defeat, while SEAL Team 6 stood watch, their rifles still warm from the fight. David Carter approached James, his young face etched with exhaustion, the battered laptop clutched tight. "Sir," he said, voice low, "we've got it all, Shadow Echo, the PMC, everything. The feds are taking it from here." James took the laptop, its screen flickering with files that peeled back decades of lies. "Shadow Echo," he muttered, scrolling through classified documents. "Nerve agents, mind control experiments, funding trails leading to shell companies and government clearances." One name stood out, bolded in a memo dated 5 years back: Colonel Ryan Mitchell. James froze, his breath catching. Ryan! His old mentor from SEAL training, the man who'd pinned his first commendation, who'd shared beers with him after missions. A friend. Now a shadow, pulling strings. "Ryan?" James said aloud, his voice a mix of disbelief and fury. He knew. The memo detailed Ryan's oversight of Shadow Echo, his signature authorizing tests in rural towns like River's Edge, perfect cover for untraceable experiments. Another file linked back to Henry's refusal to sell the land in 2004, a refusal that had marked the Brooks family for this nightmare. "They didn't just want the farm," James said, his hands tightening on the device. "They wanted silence." Carter nodded, his jaw tight. "There's more, sir. Payments to Hayes PMC, orders to escalate if locals resisted. Your dad, he stumbled onto a test site years ago, didn't he? That's why they came back." James's mind flashed to a memory. Henry, furious one summer, ranting about strange lights and dead crops near the south field, brushed off as a farmer's paranoia. "He tried to tell me," James said, guilt clawing anew. "I didn't listen." The FBI lead agent, a wiry man named Kessler, approached, his badge glinting in the sun. "Commander Brooks," he said, voice clipped but respectful, "we've got Salazar and Hayes in custody. That laptop's a gold mine. Shadow Echo's done, but we need your statement. This goes higher than we thought." James handed it over, his eyes never leaving Clara's still form. "It's not just evidence," he said, his tone steel. "It's my parents' blood. Make it count." Kessler nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else. We intercepted a transmission. Hayes was reporting to someone before we shut him down. Could be your Colonel Mitchell. He's off-grid now, but we'll find him." James's fists clenched, a storm brewing behind his eyes. "Ryan. Brother-in-arms turned traitor? Good," he said curtly. "I want him found." As the feds hauled Salazar and Hayes away, James turned to the townsfolk gathered nearby. Ellie Dawson, Jack Turner, Dr. Sarah Nguyen, and little Tommy still clutching those corn seeds. Their faces were drawn, eyes red from smoke and tears, but they stood firm, a quiet strength holding them together. Ellie stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "James, Clara, she saved us all. Henry, too. What they did, it's why we're still here." James swallowed hard, his throat tight. "They died for this place," he said, his voice breaking. "For me, for you." He knelt by Clara, pressing a hand to her cheek one last time, then stood, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "I'll make sure the world knows. Shadow Echo, Ryan, all of it. They don't get to hide." Dr. Nguyen approached, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. "I'll take care of them," she said gently, nodding to Henry and Clara's bodies. "They'll have a proper goodbye." James nodded, unable to speak, his chest aching with the loss of both parents in a single night. A price paid to unearth a truth he'd never wanted to find. Later, as the sun dipped toward noon, James stood before two makeshift crosses hammered into the earth where the farmhouse once stood. The feds had cleared out, taking the bomb and prisoners, leaving River's Edge to its silence. James traced the names carved into the wood: Henry Brooks, Clara Brooks, his fingers lingering on the rough grain. "You gave me strength," he said, his voice a vow. "Now I'll give the world the truth." A rustle broke his reverie. Deputy Ben Lawson, Sheriff Tom Wheeler's right hand, jogging up with a sealed envelope. "Found this in Salazar's truck," Ben said, breathless. "It's addressed to you." James tore it open, his blood chilling as he pulled out a photo. Him and Ryan Mitchell, laughing over beers years ago. A moment of camaraderie now stained by betrayal. Scrawled beneath it in sharp black ink, "Shadow Echo isn't over. Watch your back." James crumpled the paper, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. Ryan was out there, a ghost in the machine, and this fight wasn't done. He turned to the crosses, his resolve steeling. "They thought they could bury us," he said, his voice low and fierce. "They were wrong." The townsfolk gathered closer, Tommy planting the first seed beside the crosses, his small hands digging into the ash. Ellie joined him, then Jack, then Sarah, a silent promise taking root. James watched, the weight of his parents' sacrifice settling into a purpose he couldn't ignore. Shadow Echo had taken everything, but it wouldn't take their legacy, not while he still breathed. River's Edge stood quiet, the wind carrying the faint scent of corn and smoke, a town reborn in the shadow of truth. James slipped the photo into his pocket, a soldier's vow etched in his heart. This wasn't the end. Not yet. The afternoon sun bathed River's Edge, Texas, in a golden glow, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold ash that blanketed the Brooks farm. James Brooks stood beside two simple wooden crosses, the names Henry Brooks and Clara Brooks carved deep into the grain, a silent tribute to the parents he'd lost in a single night. The air still carried the faint sting of smoke, but the nerve gas had dissipated, leaving behind a quiet that felt both mournful and alive. He knelt, pressing a hand to the earth where their blood had soaked, his fingers tracing the spot where Clara's last breath had faded. "You gave me everything," he whispered, his voice thick with grief and gratitude. "Now I'll carry it forward." Around him the town stirred, a slow, steady pulse of life rising from the ruins. Ellie Dawson knelt a few feet away, her diner apron swapped for a pair of gardening gloves, digging small holes in the ash with a trowel. Jack Turner hauled a sack of salvaged corn seeds, his grizzled face set with determination, while Dr. Sarah Dwin passed out water bottles to a handful of volunteers, farmers, shopkeepers, kids, all drawn together by the unspoken bond of Sir. Little Tommy Turner, Jack's son, crouched beside James, his small hands cradling a fistful of seeds Clara had entrusted to him. "Mr. James," he said, his voice soft but steady, "these are from Mrs. Clara. She said they'd grow strong." James looked at the boy, his throat tightening as he took a seed, its rough husk a lifeline to his mother's final moments. "They will," he said, his voice breaking. "She made sure of it." He pressed the seed into the soil beside the crosses, Tommy mirroring him, and together they covered it with a handful of ash, a fragile beginning rooted in loss. Ellie joined them, her eyes red but resolute. "This land's theirs," she said, patting the dirt, "and ours. We'll make it green again." The sound of gravel crunching under tires broke the quiet as Sheriff Tom Wheeler's cruiser rolled up, Deputy Ben Lawson at his side. Tom stepped out, his hat in hand, his face etched with the weight of the night's toll. "James," he said, his voice gruff but warm, "FBI's got Salazar and Hayes locked up tight. That Shadow Echo mess, it's blowing up in D.C. They're calling it a national scandal already." He paused, glancing at the crosses. "Your folks, they tore the lid off something big." James stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, the crumpled photo from Ryan Mitchell still burning a hole in his pocket. "They didn't just tear it off," he said, his tone low and fierce. "They died for it. And I'm not letting it stop here." Ben handed him a radio, its static crackling with updates. Congressional inquiries, military investigations, whispers of Colonel Ryan Mitchell's name surfacing in classified briefings. "He's gone dark," Ben said, his voice tight, "but they'll find him." James nodded, his jaw clenching as he slipped the photo out, staring at the younger version of himself, laughing with Ryan, a brother turned betrayer. "Let him run," he said, his voice steel. "He can't hide forever." The message scrawled beneath, "Shadow Echo isn't over." Lingered like a promise of battles yet to come, but James tucked it away, his focus shifting to the people around him. River's Edge wasn't just a target, it was a stand, and his parents had lit the spark. The planting continued, a quiet rhythm taking hold. Hands in the dirt, seeds in the ground, a town rebuilding itself one breath at a time. Dr. Nguyen knelt beside the crosses, her medical bag open as she arranged wildflowers she'd gathered from the outskirts. A makeshift wreath for Henry and Clara. "They were the heart of this place," she said, her voice soft. "Always will be." James watched, his chest aching with a pride that cut through the sorrow. "They were," he agreed, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the farmhouse once stood. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the field, Jack approached, his rough hand clapping James' shoulder. "You staying, son?" he asked, his tone blunt but kind. "This town could use you." James hesitated, the soldier in him itching to chase Ryan, to finish Shadow Echo, but the son, the man, rooted here beside these crosses, felt the pull of something deeper. "I'm not going anywhere yet," he said, his voice steady. "Not till this grows." Tommy finished planting his last seed, standing back to admire the patch of turned earth. "They'll be tall," he said, a shy smile breaking through, "like Mr. Henry said corn should be." James ruffled the boy's hair, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Tall and strong," he echoed, Clara's voice whispering in his memory. "You're enough." The day faded into dusk, the sky a tapestry of orange and purple, and River's Edge settled into a peace forged in fire and sacrifice. James lingered by the crosses as the others drifted back to town, their voices a soft hum of plans, replanting homes, replanting fields, reclaiming what Shadow Echo had tried to erase. He knelt again, pressing a hand to the soil where the first seed lay buried. "Homes where I'll always come back," he said, his voice a vow to the wind. "For you." A single sprout broke through the ash nearby, a tiny green shoot, frail but defiant, reaching for the fading light. James stared at it, his breath catching, a tear slipping free. It was Clara's seed, Henry's land, their legacy pushing through the dark, a spark of life from the ashes of death. He stood, wiping his face, his resolve a quiet fire. Shadow Echo might linger, Ryan might wait, but here, in this battered corner of Texas, something stronger endured. The night fell gentle over River's Edge, the stars peeking through a clearing sky, and James turned toward the town, his silhouette framed by the crosses and the sprout. The war wasn't over, not yet, but this was his ground now, his fight, and he'd see it through. For Henry, for Clara, for the mending heart of a community that refused to break,